have is every single one of these is different. These different means and methods to achieve the same result. Different software, different metering. This is why there's controller A, B, C, D, E. Why? Because, well, we tend to have industry buckets and we focus on how to do that and what that looks like in each and every different industry. But the question that we had early on at Atom Power was, why can't this happen at the circuit breaker? I mean, from the perspective of a real estate agent, it's location, location, location. It's at the best location possible to be able to do this same stuff. And if you could do something with that circuit breaker, you could create a universal device that does what you actually need to do, which is to control the consumption of energy and to have visibility into it. So yeah, what if we look there? And so the circuit breakers are something we don't think a whole lot about, but they are everywhere. It's about 32 on average per home, about 130 per floor, the average high-rise building. And we've got thousands of breakers per neighborhood. There are millions of breakers for every city out there. And about 150 million are sold in North America every year. A number that still baffles me. I don't know where they all go, but that's a lot of circuit breakers. So let's talk about that. The breaker's got a humble beginning. Thomas Edison patented the first circuit breaker in, I don't know, 140 years ago, whatever year that was. And this changed a little bit. So the modern kind of form factor, go to Lowe's or Home Depot, pick up a breaker, that's about 80 years old. So what's shown in the picture here. Now, circuit breakers have an interesting history, and it speaks to why aren't they doing some of the things that we talked about earlier. Circuit breakers were built originally and still to this day to protect the circuit from fire. That's it. They're not there to protect people. They don't care about the equipment. But if something goes wrong, like a short circuit or overload, that breaker's going to open up so that you don't cause a fire. That's it. It's the only reason they exist today. So the other interesting thing about breakers is that 100%, with the exception of Atom Power, they are purely mechanical. Meaning if you open one up, imagine a very complex mousetrap. That's what's in the circuit breaker. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about residential, commercial, industrial, data centers are all built the same way on the same technology, utilizing the same means and methods for the same singular purpose. So that gets kind of difficult to really innovate on that, because kind of like if you look at the telephone, I hate to use that analogy, it gets overused a lot, but in this regard, it really is useful. It's like saying, okay, if we took a rotary phone, which is purely mechanical version of the phone, how can we make that into a smartphone? It is impossible. You can't do it. The reason is because the mechanics and the physics behind the mechanics actually dictate what it does. Mechanical things are purpose-built for their application. So you can't really use software to make that rotary phone something different, which is why you have to go to a semiconductor-based product. So if you wanted to really something, I personally realized that when I was at UNC Charlotte, the year 2003, this is when the idea to me first came to be, was that if you really wanted to have universal control over energy, you had to do something with that circuit breaker, particularly the one that is called the branch circuit breaker, which is just a fancy word meaning the last one in the system. You had to make it solid state. You couldn't rely on the physics of a mechanical product because every single breaker would then be purpose-built and have their own limitations. Most importantly, you really couldn't define anything through software. So to do this, the breaker had to change from mechanical to a digital solid state version. So the question is, why aren't there any on the market? Well, it turns out that the barrier to entry to even making a breaker as they're made today is really, really high. So it's a heavily regulated environment. Anything behind the meter is. So we've got the first barrier, which is UL. And UL is sort of the FDA equivalent to bringing an electrical product into the public market. There's UL 49 and several other standards that relate to how breakers are made safely and reliable, et cetera. And then you have the National Fire Protection Association, which is the NFPA. They're the ones who write the National Electrical Code, the Plumbing Code, the Life Safety Code, lots of codes they have to tell you how to construct buildings safely. Residential, commercial, industrial, doesn't matter. They don't ever cite UL, but they reference approved third-party listing agency. So they're kind of tied together. And then the means and methods for building breakers has really been quite old and pretty centralized to about 4 companies that pretty much dominate the planet for circuit breakers. So there's a few large companies who hold most of the knowledge base behind this. And then, of course, on the far right there, if you want to make a different breaker, not just one like what's being made today, well, then you need to know all this stuff, but then you also need to have a very deep knowledge of semiconductors, specifically power semiconductors and software, cybersecurity, and lots of things that just create a huge barrier to doing just this. But in 2019, Atom Power did commercialize the first ever solid-state circuit breaker in the world and achieved the first ever UL listing for a solid-state breaker in history. And all this happened in Charlotte, North Carolina. And for the first time, really, things became digital. And we were able to control our circuit breakers through software application, to create end-to-end encryption, and to remotely control things over millions of operations, adjust time current curves, a lot of engineering stuff that's interesting, but we're going to get into the core of this. So basically what this enabled us to do was to really focus in by 2020 on what was to be called, or what was being called the energy transition. So we hear this term a lot. And we have very simplistic minds at Atom Power, so we tend to think, okay, well, what does the energy transition actually mean? And if you look at it, it can mean a lot, but really at its core, it means electrifying everything. It's effectively what it is, right? Getting away from fossil fuels and electrifying everything, putting everything on the grid. That's the energy transition, or some grid. And there's a few key things that are involved with doing that, which is going to be advanced demand response, assisting in some of the gaps that are in DER systems, as well as having intelligent energy managed electric vehicle charging. So just a quick highlights. We're on our 3rd generation of products today. This is our 3rd UL listed solid state breaker. Some cool things. It happens to be the fastest circuit breaker in the world. We're around 3,000 times faster than the fastest breaker on the market. That means interrupting time. So if we see a fault, we interrupt very, very quickly. This has some impacts on arc flash, if anyone's ever dealt with that. We lower arc flash in an equivalent percentage. We also have the highest fault current rating of any circuit breaker in the world at 200,000 amps. That's sort of longhand for basically saying you can put these in any building anywhere. It doesn't matter what the environment is. The largest data center or the smallest home fed from a 25 kVA transformer. And it's hundreds of products built within a single breaker. And this eventually leads to EV charging. So when I say hundreds of products, there's a lot that we could talk about there. But one of the kind of fundamental things is you can tell the circuit breaker what you want it to be. It's purely software defined. So in other words, if you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, that's usually the easiest reference. If you pick up a circuit breaker, it's usually a 20 amp or 40 amp or 50 amp or 100 amp, et cetera. Again, purpose built for its application. 100 amp breaker, it can never be anything else. 40 amp breaker can never be anything else. So we kind of put made our platform on 100 amp and less. About 85% of the breakers behind the meter are 100 amp and less across North America, and really across the planet as well. So shown here is a 100 amp, 3-phase, 480 volt breaker. And you can use software, though, to change its characteristics. So that's also a 90 amp breaker, an 80 amp breaker, a 70 amp breaker, all the way down to 15 amp if you want it to be. So you can dynamically change its characteristics, and it's UL listed for every single increment in between. There's nothing like this on the market. There's a lot more to it than that, like there's integrated metering, frequency response, things like that that are more engineering centric, but nonetheless, there's a lot of things that are built into a single product. So how we're applying this today is where we see the highest impact markets. I won't talk too much about the one on the right that's coming out later this year, but on the left is we are basically taking our same third generation product and making it an EV charger. Why? Because we have all the elements that an EV charger has within the breaker. And so we said, okay, let's just rebrand that something else. We call it purple. And that's our EV charging system. Go to the next slide. And so this is where the shift starts to happen in infrastructure that can also charge vehicles. Kind of like the earlier slides we showed about, what is in an EV charger? Well, all those things we spoke of. We have circuit protection, the control system, telemetry, communication software. So the novelty here is we're charging directly from the circuit breaker. So why would we do that? Well, it's because you have to have a circuit breaker ahead of every EV charger today anyway. That's the code, National Electrical Code. So if you're going to have to buy a panel board and circuit breaker anyway to feed EV chargers, why not just make the breaker something that can do that? So it sounds cool at first. It turns out it's really cool because you can solve a lot of major pain points. So those pain points are really associated with our markets. So we focus in on multifamily as well as fleet. So fleet being parcel pickup delivery, municipals, and commercial fleets. Basically anywhere where you have to charge and you have to charge at scale, and that's multifamily and fleets. We don't focus so much on the 3 chargers at the Trader Joe's or the single family home charger. Anywhere where there needs to be lots of chargers in a single location is where we focus. And there are some specific pain points in those areas. Particularly, customers want something they could run a car into. Believe it or not, that's what they want. They don't want screens, they don't want card readers, they don't want anything fancy. They want a baller that if they had to, they could hit their car into it. That's what they want, something really stupid out in the public. And that's what we've done. Our pedestals, we have wall boxes as well, are just wire termination blocks with a plug. And so some side effects of this is that this makes it really scalable, because now we've stripped away all the smart stuff out of the pedestal, put it into the infrastructure, and we make a pedestal, we make a wall box, but technically that could be anything. If you're putting in EV charging, say at on the side of the street, all you need is a junction box and a cord set. That's it. Everything else is done on the infrastructure side. Makes a highly flexible, scalable product. We charge all the way up to 80 amps, so we're full level 2. We're not in DC yet, but what we found is that the majority of the market still today, vast majority is level 2. Even for parcel pickup delivery fleets, a lot of folks tend to think DC. What we're seeing is actually 80 amp AC works fine. It won't be the case all the time, but so far that's the case. And so just some customer value propositions and what are value propositions? Value propositions are what customers feedback to us. We originally conceptualized this product based on customers' feedback on some of the pain points they were experiencing while trying to install large-scale charging. So these are just the short list of them. Customers in particularly that space need something really simple. They don't want high-value equipment out in the public. Vandalism, cars running into them, weather, things like that. They want something that's super low maintenance. So if you're familiar with EV charging as it stands today, basically every other manufacturer, the pedestal itself is sort of the appliance. So is the wall box. Like the charging function is built into that thing that you put on the wall or mount at the street. A major pain point there is maintenance. And it's not so much that they require a lot of maintenance. It's just that those products are UL listed as an EV charger. Okay. So the side effect of that is that if that thing breaks, how do you actually perform maintenance on it? Well, generally speaking, you have to bring it back up to its UL standard. What does that mean? You have to have a factory trained technician or a factory technician that can certify that they've brought that product, if it breaks, back up to a UL standard. Major pain point, and this is why every other charge manufacturer has lengthy maintenance agreements because of that reason. So if it breaks, you have to then call them to come out and fix it. This is why if you use PlugShare, which is an app, you'll see how many level 2 chargers, public chargers, are down. They're not down because they break a lot. They're down because of that reason. How many maintenance folks does charging manufacturer A have versus B? Not many, compared to the population of, say, electricians. And that's where things change here. So who can work on this product if it breaks? It's a panel board, circuit breakers, a wire termination block, electricians, property management. Really, really scalable product in that way is that you don't have to worry about maintenance. You've got the people to do it. Pretty cost effective too. So we're not at a premium at all. We're actually the lower cost product on the market, not on purpose. It just happens to be that way. Once you consolidate everything into the infrastructure that you have to buy anyway, turns out it becomes a very effective, cost-effective product. And then I would say one of the largest value propositions that we've heard and we're acting on quite extensively is in the energy management piece of this, which we have a slide on that in a minute. There's also an advantage in make ready. So if there's a make ready program, even if there's not, if you're looking to make a site make ready, there is no better way than have infrastructure that can charge the vehicles. That pedestal can be anything you want it to be. Doesn't really matter. It's just now you have the infrastructure that's ready to charge vehicles. The energy management piece is probably one of the top value propositions for two major reasons. And this is a snapshot actually of our own facility. So we use our own chargers at our headquarters in Huntersville, North Carolina. Of 12 chargers, we do not have the power to feed all 12 chargers. So what do? We have an automatic load management system built into all of our products. We actually have day one. That was where we started was, have a smart breaker inside of a smart panel, and you can energy manage quite effectively in a centralized location. And this scales. You could have one panel or 100 panels. Doesn't matter. They all communicate together and they all do the same thing out of the box. No special software you have to buy. And so what we do is we get a feedback loop from our building meter and we say, okay, we'll throttle down the charge rate if we do not have the capacity and boost the charge rate if we do. Because what we're finding is that most folks actually have the capacity, but the engineers say you don't have the capacity because they do the National Electrical Code calculations that basically tell them, yeah, you only have 100 kilowatts in this case, where actually they have quite a bit more than that. This is our case as well. So what we are able to do here is to lower a major barrier to entry by under provisioning the infrastructure for the amount of chargers. Like in our case, we didn't do anything to our infrastructure. Other customers, same thing. Out of the box, you can do energy management and not have to pay so much for infrastructure. We use a ratio that kind of varies depending on what the use case is, 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 8 sometimes. But that's a major barrier right now, especially to fleets, believe it or not. Even some of the big fleets, they don't just jump in and say, okay, put up millions of dollars of infrastructure in for my 10 cars that are coming next month. No, it's a slow trickle, to get there. That's what we found. And also lowers peak demand costs. So yeah, you basically can cap the charge rate once you start hitting, your building starts hitting a peak, which can be a large portion of your bill, we found out. So we do that ourselves. And that is a day 2 savings for customers to significantly lower their peak demand costs. And this is just a snapshot of our own facility. So this is a little bit of an eye chart. I apologize. Probably can't see it on this screen, but on the upper right, there's 2 red arrows that point down. That just shows that we capped ours at 60 kilowatts. And so as we start to hit those peaks that are shown here on the upper right, well, let me explain what you're looking at. The top graph here is our combination of all the charge load we have. That's the third line. And then our total building load on the upper line. The smaller buckets here, where we says, the 4 that sit at the bottom. It's actually each charging station. We have 12 total, but I couldn't show all 12 here, so I'm just showing 4. But you can see where it dips. It dips in response to us hitting a 60 kilowatt peak. It does that real time instantaneously. And we've used this for quite a long time now. It's highly effective at managing our own peaks, and with customers the same way. We have an installation in New York City, 550 charging stations in a single building. 6 megawatts technically, if you really loaded everything up. And there's a lot of money to be paid in peak demand costs should they reach that. So we're using this as well there. And I have 45 seconds left, but I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this if I could, is just to highlight a bit of a regional story here. I'm a native Charlottean, which makes me a native North Carolinian. I'm very proud to be here. We take we do a lot of activity in our own area, especially in our region. We tend to focus in on hiring from UNC Charlotte, as well as NC State University, for a large portion of our employees. 70% of those employees, we're a small team, a little bit less than 50. Actually, I think we're at 49 now. We're growing. We're expecting to double that this year, which is character building in and of itself to do that at this time. And then we've got a large portion are in the engineering manufacturing. Everything's made at our headquarters. We're completely vertically integrated. All the software, all of our end products, all our manufactured, everything ships out to customers from Huntersville, North Carolina. And something that we're always trying to improve on, but I'm at least proud to say this, is over 50% of our components are sourced not from the US as broad, but from North Carolina. 50% of our products today are sourced from North Carolina, something we're always trying to improve upon, sort of a farm to breaker approach, I guess, if you will. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the end. It was an honor to be here. And yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to see you all. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if so, I'm happy to answer.
You've done a fantastic, thank you. We're very proud of you being a graduate of University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and glad to have you still in the Charlotte metro area. As you and I know from talking in the past, there's a lot of layers of your onion to peel back in terms of innovation. We could talk for another rest of the day on all the different aspects of it. But I know that one of the most incredible things that you've achieved is a universal 200 kiloamp short circuit current rating from UL. Can you tell us a little bit about how you innovated your way to a storied but somewhat slow to move listing agency to accept that?
Yeah, the 200K rating was a part of the UL story for sure. You know, it's interesting. UL, it's one of those, like when we started off, it was a long road, but when we started the coordinating with UL on listing this product originally, we thought it was going to be sort of the county sheriff approach, you know, kind of like what we showed, the barriers to entry. What we found though was quite the opposite. I mean, not to the extent it made it easy on us, but it was the opposite in the way that we realized after speaking with UL, the folks we were engaged with had been looking literally at the same types of products for several generations within UL. So we came to them and we had a different approach, and we weren't, you know, 100% ready for UL, but at the same time, when we first came to them and said, this is what we're looking to do, and how do we achieve a UL 49 listing, which is, you know, basically the breaker listing in North America, it was actually, we got a lot of engagement with UL, a lot. Now, that was all spiritual engagement, and then ended up though, and that's another story, is that we have to adhere to many standards and not just UL 49 because we're special. You know, we're a digital product, so we have, you know, there's UL 1998, UL 991, UL 567, UL 508. I mean, UL 1557, we make our own silicon carbide modules. That's one thing I missed out there, but so they all have to fall under that. I mean, we have many, many different standards we have to adhere to. So in that way, it's been tough, but spiritually, UL and Atom Power get along quite well. Yeah, the 200K rating was an interesting test. I'd love to show a video of that sometime, but it's a crazy test setup they have for that. 200,000 amps, you know. All right, thanks. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan, for growing a successful North Carolina company, a business, sharing your knowledge and insight. I learned a lot. I'm not an electrical engineer, but I think it's a fine example of when we have technology that's well in front of policy and regulation, and overcoming the barriers of entry are important. So thanks for the presentation. Next on our agenda, we've got a quick update on the Carolinas Natural Gas Coalition. And Kristen Beckham, Director of External Affairs at BHE GT&S, and thank goodness for the acronym. She's going to join us. Kristen, please come on up and take the stage.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. If it's okay, if the engineers can't figure out the slides, I'm going to let y'all take care of them for me too. So I am Kristen Beckham. I am a confused Carolina girl. Half my family is North Carolina, half is South. And that's some of the premise behind what I would quickly like to introduce is the Carolinas Natural Gas Coalition. And I want to thank David and Justin with API, along with everyone at the chamber here, for allowing us to come speak today and present. So if we can go ahead and switch, y'all know this. Y'all know that natural gas is a huge part of economic development. It's what helps keep our lights on. It's what powers our homes and so much more. We heat with it, we cook with it, but we know this story, but that doesn't mean that others do. So this coalition is a concerted effort to focus on natural gas, specifically in the Carolinas. So we can switch slides. So in North Carolina specifically, 1 in 4 users uses natural gas in their households. It is considered a politically positive. Polling shows that it's supported in both North and South Carolina. There's additional demand constantly for it, especially with economic development. And about 33% of generation uses natural gas in North Carolina alone. So we know this story, like I said, but we want to make sure that the public knows it, that our leaders know it, that the community knows it. So several of us got together last year, if we can switch slides, please. We started talking about this and how can we help educate the public better about the future of natural gas. We hear a lot about so many great things that are happening in energy, but natural gas is a key component of that. So the Natural Gas Coalition was formed in 2021. And we have many players that are already involved. We have new groups signing up every day. And I do want to put a little plug in your packet. There is a 1-pager with additional information on it. So I want to make sure you have that. I'd love to have y'all all participate and join in. But we already have industry groups. We have pipeline companies. We have economic developers. We have municipalities. We have associations. We have some producers and consumers. And the group is growing every day. So thank you to those of you who are already members. We have members already in the room, but we want to make sure we continue to grow and share that voice. And what we're trying to do with our mission, thank you, is it's not just about the big energy companies. It is about the plumbers who work on natural gas. It is about the economic developers who are trying to chase projects and need natural gas in that area. So it is a collective approach to show the whole conversation from our consultants, maybe our environmental consultants, to our pipeline companies that develop and build and provide that pipeline for us in the Carolinas, or maybe it's a construction company. All these groups are part of this coalition. So we are trying to be a collective united voice for the entire scope of natural gas. So briefly, our mission, as you see here, is to provide natural gas education and advocacy across the Carolinas. So when we hear a lot about a lot of different pieces of energy, we want to make sure that the natural gas voice is heard too. and that the people have a educated and aware voice so that they can be better informed. And many are, everyone in this room, many in this room would do that every day, but this is a way for us to have a united voice around natural gas. So the policy landscape, as I've talked about before, briefly, it's positive in North and South Carolina. Natural gas is they like it. Politically, they like it. The polling shows that we've seen it, but there are ways for us to continue to grow and protect and defend. So there are ways for us, we want to advance positive natural gas policy, but we also want to protect and defend. You've seen all across the US, there are conversations about natural gas bans. There are legislation that's been passed in other areas of the Southeast, except for in North and South Carolina, that ban that local decisions on banning natural gas. So we are taking an offensive and a defensive approach on this to educate the public and the elected officials in a productive way, in an educational way about natural gas. So we would love, again, to have you as part of this. I want to make sure to leave time for questions at the end of this. But what this does is we are providing education to our members. We want everyone to be united to, hey, what are you hearing? What are we hearing? We want to provide education on for our engineers. And we're partnering with other groups to make sure that they know what's going on in community and awareness. We are providing information about the environmental benefits and stewardship around natural gas. There's a lot of misinformation on that front. So we provide that information as well. And again, there's just so many myths around natural gas. And y'all know this, I see many of you shaking your heads right here, that we want to make sure that we can help dispel that. So we can't do that alone. We need your help. And so that's where some of our member benefits, we have a newsletter that goes out regularly. We want to engage with one another. We have conversations on a growing basis. And the reason why some of these are a little more vague is that we just started last year. So we are on the ground floor of this. So that's where everyone has the opportunity to help provide your voice and input. And that's what I'm here to ask for today. So if there are ways that you think we should engage differently, if there are conversations where we need to be in the room having this conversation, please let us know. If you want to be part of this, please come join in. So this shares a little bit about our benefits and our member details, but we'll just flip one more slide if I can. So this is a list of some of our members. In 6 months, you can see quite a few members up there. So that shows you that demand and that need is real. So want to, again, thank our members who are here. Thank those that are virtually watching as well. Ask that you join in and participate. We intentionally have it at a lot of different levels. We are trying to be as inclusive as possible and want your voice to be part of that. So I want to thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. The one thing I'll share lastly, this is our board. It is a growing board. It is a growing group of members who, we are not just a group where you sign up and we have this group that does everything for you. We are a member-driven organization. So your voice matters. And I don't know how else to say it better than that, other than we want you to be involved and we want you in a meaningful, real way. Your voice is equally important as each and every other one. So just thank you so much for letting me be here to share this today. Appreciate it. If you have questions, be here all day. Please like us on LinkedIn. We're on Facebook. We are on Twitter. And we have our website, carolinasgas.com. So thank you so very, very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Kristen, we appreciate you taking the time to provide us that update. I learned a lot. Looks like you've got a good start. Natural gas is certainly an important part of the energy resources in the Carolinas and the Southeast. Next, I want to welcome Trevor Pearson, Senior Associate Director of APCO Worldwide. He's going to introduce speakers for the much anticipated presentation on what the federal infrastructure bill means for the energy sector. So Trevor, why don't you come up to the stage and take it away?
Well, thank you, George. Appreciate the welcome. And as George mentioned, I am a Senior Associate Director at APCO Worldwide. APCO is a strategic communications firm that brings together industry, government, and community stakeholder engagement. We have deep roots right here in North Carolina. We also are supported by a fully integrated network of experts across the country and across the world. Specifically, I work in our government relations and our energy practice after spending more than a decade on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. As an energy and natural resources policy advisor in the House and Senate, which is why I'm thrilled to be here today at this event, looking at the intersection of public policy and energy industry innovation. I look forward to hearing from each of our experts today and for moderating our panel discussion. First, we'll hear from Christopher Guth, Senior Vice President of Policy at the U.S. Chamber Global Energy Institute. Next up, we'll have Mark McIntyre, Director of Government Affairs at Duke Energy. And we'll close with a segment from John Morrison, CEO of E4 Carolinas. We ask that you please hold your questions for our speakers until the end of their opening remarks. At that time, we'll take a short networking break, then we'll reconvene together for our panel discussion and Q&A. So we can bring our panelists up to the stage here. We have Christopher, Mark, and John.
Good morning. I'm Christopher. I work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Great to finally be on the road again, talking about energy, proselytizing about all the good things that it's bringing to our economies, especially in states like the Carolinas, where you have vibrant economies and growing energy demand. We're largely here ostensibly to talk about what the bipartisan infrastructure bill means for energy. And I can't say that there's probably another piece of legislation that is going to be as impactful within the energy sector as this bill. When it comes to infrastructure, the U.S. Chamber has always been the leader in DC because it's a multi-sectoral issue. And this particular bill is, as they say, once in a generation when it comes to surface transportation, but I'll let my colleagues who handle surface transportation talk about that. When it comes to energy, climate, and innovation, it's the first of a kind, and maybe the first that we'll see in some time to come. Can you, so first, a little bit of a seed setter. We're in this point now where companies are all racing to get to net zero or as close as they can. You have investors in those companies pushing them. You have customers in those companies pulling them. But it's important to remember that the transition cannot happen any faster than the pace of innovation, which is to say, you can't just wave a magic wand and have new technologies that enable us to transition without sacrificing reliability or affordability. Specifically, the UN itself tells us that roughly 45% of the technologies necessary to decarbonize the global economy don't exist yet. They don't exist. You can't transition unless they exist. We have plenty of technologies that do exist. We can get, that doesn't mean we don't race to get as far as we can, but the point is the long pole in the tent are those technologies where there's overwhelming scientific consensus we need development of. This bill makes a huge down payment in the US government, working with academia, working with industry, developing those technologies. One of the things that's really unique about this, and I say this understanding that I'm an inside the Beltway wonk, is this bill, for the first time in almost 30 years, gives the Department of Energy the authority to build demonstration projects. So there's scientific consensus that there's a necessity to have some combination of storage, whether it's battery or hydrogen, advanced nuclear, and perhaps most importantly, carbon capture, utilization and sequestration. The problem is these are all first of a kind technologies. First of a kind technologies are very risky. Risky projects sometimes take longer, almost always cost more. And therefore there's a disincentive for the private sector to take that risk on their balance sheet on behalf of their shareholders. So what Congress did here is said, hey, DOE, you go out and you build the first of a kind. We know it's going to be messy. We know first of a kind engineering is always problematic. But if we want to get these projects, these types of technologies out into commercial use, the federal government is going to absorb that risk. And then once they built it, once they perfect it, the nth of a kind technology is now available. All the IP is available for industry to go out and replicate across the board. So there's roughly $83 billion directed at the Department of Energy. That's a massive amount of money. It's the most amount of money it's ever had. There was something approaching $30 billion in the stimulus bill in 2009. That was mostly designed to just throw money out immediately to stimulate the economy. These are mid to long-term investments to really bring those technologies to market. The Department of Energy supervises the national laboratories in this country. Arguably the most important part of our infrastructure when it comes to developing not just energy, but also science, medicine. But for the purposes here, it's those national labs working with industry to bring those technologies to market. Like I said, carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, crucial. Even if we had a storage solution so that within the electricity sector, we could run the grid reliably with just renewables and existing nuclear, that doesn't solve our industrial problem. Industrial emitters use technologies where they literally take molecules and break them apart and necessarily emits CO2. So unless we want to no longer have things like pharmaceuticals or fertilizers or even plastics, cosmetics, we're going to have to find a way to continue to develop and manufacture them without having emissions. CCUS is really the only way to do that. And in the developing world, where they're using more and more coal and gas, they need a way to continue to use that coal and gas and capture those CO2 emissions. Because otherwise, even if we decarbonized our entire economy and all of Europe, we would still see emissions continue to rise. So CCUS is incredibly important. Advanced nuclear, we're talking about not the ginormous 1,000 megawatt reactors that you see scattered throughout the Carolinas. We're talking about much more nimble, small reactors that go down to as small as 5 megawatts or 50 megawatts, and then they can be stacked together. They can be brought to industrial sites where you get not only emissions-free electricity, but you also get hydrogen and you get processed heat. Storage, like I said, renewables are growing and have grown at various points exponentially, but there is ultimately, from a mathematical standpoint, a glass ceiling because it cannot be dispatched 24/7. They're intermittent. So we need that storage solution, whether it's batteries, the next generation of batteries, I would say, or perhaps hydrogen to back up and enable capture of the electrons that those renewables generate when the demand is low, and then dispatch when there's no wind or sunlight and the demand is high. And then finally, hydrogen. Hydrogen works, like I said, not only on the storage side potentially, but also on the transportation side. Our lithium-ion batteries are doing wonders in electric vehicles, and they get more and more efficient every day. But when it comes to heavy-duty vehicles, they just don't have the juice, literally and figuratively. So we're looking at alternate technologies. Right now, hydrogen is kind of in the lead going into the clubhouse as far as being able to power things like semi-trucks and locomotives without having any emissions. And then finally, minerals. It's really important to remember that all of these new platforms require strategic minerals, massive amounts of them. The United States has a lot of them, but we have this aversion to mining. Every time I talk to folks in Washington, talk about developing critical minerals, strategic minerals, they say, fine, how do we do it? Well, we have to enable siting of more mines. Whoa, mining. When you say mining, they generally think of 1960s Appalachia and mountaintop removal, as opposed to what they really are, the most sustainable mines in the world, almost exclusively in the West. If you look at Alaska alone, it has enough strategic minerals to service the US demand and probably global demand for decades to come. We just cannot site mines. And that's a problem because without those minerals, we can't have electric vehicles. We cannot have wind and solar generation. And right now we're something approaching, depending upon how you define it, 90% dependent upon China, not only for the production of those minerals, but also the refining of those minerals. We need to get back into that business. And the final thing I'll leave you with, it's not just investing. This bill is not just investing in development of energy innovation and technology. It also, for the first time ever, addresses the inability to cite anything in this country. The National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, has been a godsend over the course of its 50 years as far as enabling public involvement and engagement when it comes to siting and permitting projects. But it's gotten to the point now where it makes it impossible, literally impossible, to build many, many things. So for the first time ever, what this law does is it takes an incremental step in saying, at least we can all agree that for whatever project is going through the federal permitting process, there needs to be one agency that's in charge of that process. Because what we've seen over the last 20 years, agencies fight. Oh, well, you have a role? Great. I have a role too. And mine's more important than yours. Oh, wait, yours is more important than mine. And then all of a sudden the project sponsor sitting there with billions of dollars on the sideline is saying, wait a second, can't we all just figure out how this is going to work? So in the previous administration, this was a rule. Now Congress, in a very bipartisan way, took a step forward and said, this is now the law. Agencies, you have to be a little more efficient, and you have to designate one single lead. And then finally, $7 billion for the battery supply chain. I talked about the minerals. There's more than just mining. There's also recycling them. And there's finding ways around the world to diversify our supply. And so with that, I'm very excited about this bill. I think we'll look back 10 years from now and say this is the most important climate legislation ever passed in the world, because without these advanced technologies, we are never going to get to net zero. But just like getting to the moon, just like developing the internet, I will never lack faith in American engineers and scientists. So thank you very much.
So I have an aversion to PowerPoint. This is my PowerPoint here, my note card. So you're stuck with me. Excuse me. First thing I want to do is thank the chamber. You folks do an amazing job with advocacy, but also convening conversations like this, which are so important. George talked a little bit about the fact that we are all energy professionals, right? We're not trying to convince the layperson, but I believe that that's probably the most important part of our jobs, because we exist in an industry that's complex and we talk about issues that are confusing. And so if you take away anything from our conversation today, I hope it's some nuggets that empower you to go out to your grocery store or your PTA meeting or your church or your ball field, and you have conversations with your neighbors and your community members to help them appreciate the complexity of what it is we're all trying to accomplish. Before I do anything else, though, I want to address the elephant in the room, and that is my headshot. So I was in Wilmington a couple of weeks ago for an in-person meeting, and that same headshot was used. And I had two different people come up to me, independent of each other, and say, we didn't realize that glamour shots was still a thing. Now, many of you won't know what glamour shots is because they don't exist anymore. But when I was growing up, if you wanted a really amazing headshot, you went to glamour shots. I don't have a professional headshot. I've never had one. So the photo that I have is a photo taken by my daughter. And so no glamour shot jokes. All right. So we're going to get that out of the way. Thank you for being here. You know, I've heard a lot about the energy transition, and we like to think that the energy transition is new, but in fact, it's not in North Carolina. Show of hands, how many people have moved to North Carolina within the last 20 years or so? Higher, so everybody can see them. So for all you newcomers, we've been in the midst of an energy transition since about 2002. Anybody, show of hands, know what happened in 2002 in our sector? Anybody? Clean smokestacks. When I think about the energy transition, I go back to clean smokestacks. So clean smokestacks was a first of its kind piece of legislation in North Carolina, collaborative energy policy that wasn't designed to chase carbon. It wasn't designed to transition the way that we generate or deliver electricity. It was designed to reduce emissions of ambient air quality standards like sulfur dioxide and NOx. Incredibly effective. And it was a first of its kind approach. Unlike EPA programs where large industries who emitted SO2 could trade and buy credits, in North Carolina, you had to actually reduce the emissions, and those credits were essentially retired into perpetuity. And what happened? Well, we've realized like a 98% reduction in sulfur dioxide in North Carolina. We realized about a 70% reduction in NOx emissions. And of course, why did that happen? Well, clean smokestacks was designed to reduce pollutants. But what it also did was, as an ancillary benefit, it drove down emissions of carbon dioxide, right? So what did we do? We installed advanced pollution control on the more efficient coal units, and we retired the ones that weren't so efficient, and we replaced them with natural gas. So that was kind of the beginning, from my perspective, of that energy transition. Then came Senate Bill 3, right? Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard for North Carolina, the first of its kind, smart collaborative energy policy. Next up, House Bill 589. It was another really innovative piece of legislation that accelerated the pace of interconnection of renewables for the state. We've had Executive Order 80, right, which established the Clean Energy Plan process. And I sort of feel like we're reaching a crescendo with our energy policy with the Energy Solutions Act for North Carolina, which passed last year. Also House Bill 951, right? It provides us a vision for the future in North Carolina. And it's a vision that I don't think a lot of other states have. You know, I think we are uniquely positioned to take advantage of the infrastructure bill because we have a purpose as a state. We know what we're chasing. We know what we need to do, and we know generally how to get there. Many other states, I think, are at a disadvantage because they don't have collaborative energy policy making. They don't have sort of visionary policy that really does set that path. So we've got it good, I believe, in the state because we've got such strong leadership. Before I talk about sort of the perspective of the utility, at least today in North Carolina for the Jobs Act, I want to pause for a moment and talk a little bit about why I believe we do what we do. So I am the product of a military upbringing. My father was active duty military for his entire career. And when I was about 14 years old, my parents told me that we were moving. And of course, I had been in like 7 schools in 9 years, so I was used to it. But we moved to Central America. We moved to the Republic of Panama, and I lived in Panama during the Noriega years. Some of you will remember Manuel Noriega, right? The dictator in Central America. The safety of that country sort of ebbed and flowed. So me as a teenage kid going to high school there were times when I was confined to my house and times when I could travel. And when I could travel, I traveled the coastlines looking for waves, right? I loved to surf. I spent a lot of nights sleeping in hammocks, waiting for the sun to come up and get out there on that glassy ocean. But in those times when you're laying in a hammock in the dark at the edge of the jungle where it meets the ocean, and it's really dark, you can actually watch the Milky Way rise over the ocean. How many people have actually ever seen the Milky Way rise? It's extraordinary. But what do you have to watch the Milky Way rise? Darkness, right? No light pollution. And so the fact that I could see that happen led me to believe that there were no people out there, right? I was in the middle of nowhere and there were no people. It was only later that I realized that actually there were quite a few people. But what did they not have? They didn't have electricity, right? Now, this was 35 years ago or so. Didn't have access to electricity. Fast forward to my time in college, I came to NC State, the greatest university in North Carolina. Sorry, had to pause awkwardly for my Carolina friends. I came to NC State to go to college. My parents moved to Tokyo. I had 2 siblings that moved to Europe, and my oldest brother moved to West Africa in Senegal. And when I went to visit my brother in Senegal, he had running water 8 hours a day, and he had electricity about 8 hours a day. And frequently those 2 8-hour periods did not overlap. And so it required a level of life planning that none of us in this room are capable of, I believe, right? Fast forward to about 11 years ago. Before I came to work at Duke Energy, I was a consulting engineer and I was doing big infrastructure projects in the Middle East. And I was headed over in August of 2011 to Amman, Jordan, and then out into the desert to oversee construction of a project that we had designed. And you would be amazed at how hard it was to get power to that site. Really, really difficult. In a country that does not want for electricity. Everybody has it. But man, getting power to a site for a project was spectacularly difficult. And I share all of these anecdotes really just to provide a reminder to all of us how good we've got it, right? We are able to have a conversation about a transition when 1.2 billion people in this world don't have access to any of it. And so when we think about the work we have a great responsibility. We have a great responsibility to our customers. We've come to expect reliability and we've come to expect affordability. And I noted that your slide talked about reliability and affordability being table stakes to this conversation, and they really are, right? We've got to accelerate the transition that we're facing with those 2 table stakes in mind all the time. So what do we care about? the Jobs Act has a ton of stuff in it, right? When I think about the energy sector, I think about sort of the three buckets that Chris talked about. One of them is grid modernization, sort of the poles and wires. There was a lot in there about EV, electric vehicle transitions, and then there was emerging tech. And when I think about those three buckets, I think about where we are sort of on the spectrum from today to a net zero carbon future in 2050. And our Energy Solutions Act from North Carolina gives us a pathway, right? We've got to get 70% by 2030, and we've got to get to net zero by 50. So in the near term, really what we're focused on is grid, right? And the great thing about grid is when I think about grid and I think about EV, I view them as two sides of the same coin. And I think that sort of has borne out in the conversation this morning. We've got a great opportunity to make investments that ready our system for rapid decarbonization, but at the same time, you're readying the system for the 1.25 million EVs we're going to have on the road by 2030. Those of you who aren't aware of the new goal that North Carolina has coming out of Governor Cooper's Executive Order 246, it's really ambitious from an electric vehicle perspective. And so while we are thinking about decarbonizing the electric sector, we are also essentially enabling the decarbonization of the transit sector. Our sectors no longer exist as mutually exclusive things, right? These things are interrelated. It's going to require a tremendous amount of work, partnerships with most of the folks in the room. We're really excited about that opportunity, and we're going to look for opportunities to essentially lessen the burden of this transition in the near term on North Carolina customers. It would be really, really appealing to chase the shiny object, right? So the bill talks about hydrogen and advanced battery storage and advanced nuclear, and all these things are going to play a role. I don't think there's any question that they'll play a role. I'm less bullish about CCS for North Carolina. We don't have the geology that one typically thinks about when we think about carbon capture, but many of the other emerging techs are going to play a part in the story. But my view of their role is probably after 2030, 2035, 2040, as these things mature. Really, the focus for us is those opportunities that make it easier for us to effectuate this transition to 2030 and alleviate the burden on North Carolina customers. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, looking forward to your questions, and I'll introduce our next speaker.
Good morning. I'm John Morrison. Thank you. With E4 Carolinas. I want you all to know that I'm celebrating a work anniversary today. I've been with the organization all of 1 month. But it's certainly my pleasure to be here. It's a fabulous organization. I know many of you are with companies that are members of E4. For those of you who aren't familiar, if you go to the next slide, just a real quick, we serve member companies in 2 states, the Carolinas, and it's our vision to really promote, attract, and retain the energy industry here in North Carolina. We cover all sectors. We have the producers, the utilities, the independent power producers. We have the folks who make the equipment and build it, the equipment manufacturers and the EPC, engineering, procurement, construction companies. We have those who disrupt the industry, the innovators and some of the startups, and the folks who are dealing at oftentimes in the future, doing the research, the universities and research institutions. And then we have a whole variety of service providers to the utility industry, the legal firms, accounting firms, consultants, and the like that serve the industry, a full breadth, the full ecosystem, if you will, of energy. Next slide, please. Just a real quick about the organization. We have a board, a very active board, you might say. Some members are here today. 28 members. We have a staff of 12, and we operate with revenue from our members. For fees, we provide for services primarily to those members, as well as grants and contracts. And the work that we do is on the left-hand side there, really in 6 areas. I liken the organization to, some of you may remember a hockey player by the name of Wayne Gretzky, who was asked why he was so good. He was known as the greatest, I believe. He was asked why he was so good at the game. And he said, well, that's because I skate to where the puck is going to be. And I've always thought that's a great way to think about it. And to a large extent, that's what we at E4 Carolinas are trying to do, is to try to help the industry be where the puck is going to be. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is very forward looking in terms of economic development in companies we can attract and retain, in terms of workforce development, making sure that we have the workforce that we need. We have a variety of programs doing leadership training and the like. In terms of communication to consumers, from our members and certainly from E4 to our members. Innovation is a big part of what we do. Policy is one of the task forces. These are all task forces within the organization. And I'll make a point, we do not advocate or take policy positions, but our role is to inform both our members and give them access to various policymakers, and then to be a resource to those policymakers in terms of information about the energy industry. It's been noted that many of our elected leaders don't really understand our industry, and it's vital that we help them do that so that the policy we get is informed and appropriate. And the last one is a new task force. It's the South Carolina Clean Energy Industries. About a year or so ago, we brought on what had been the South Carolina Clean Energy Business Alliance. So they're now part of the stable of E4. And so that's what we cover. The items on the right are a variety of grant-funded research. I won't go into those. I'd be happy to talk about them. It's some really fascinating, it's interesting stuff going on. But they do relate to what's coming out in the infrastructure bill. And that's what I want to turn to. So then the next slide. This is a real quick pictorial of the monies that are coming. And this is the new funding that comes from that. You'll note a variety of areas. The one I'll focus on is the research and demonstration. Oops, I'm sorry. I was reading my wrong slide. I'll focus on the one that's coming from DOE. As was noted earlier, DOT is where the bulk of the money is. This really is about bridges and roads and the like. But if I may have the next slide, in the DOT budget is $15 billion for vehicle transportation, vehicle electrification. And so that's clearly an area that affects those of us here in the energy industry. The second largest one is EPA. But there again, I can have the next slide. There's, oops, I'm sorry, backed up one. There's $5 billion for electric school buses. Again, an area that's of interest to us. But the area I want to talk about is DOE and where the funding that's coming to them. Next slide, please. And a variety of areas, as I said, I'll talk to research and development in a minute. The supply chain and advanced manufacturing, that's a lot to do with batteries and storage. And we here in North Carolina actually have some companies that are foremost in the country in the area of lithium production and the like. So it's certainly very relevant to what DOE will be doing there. The second area is the weatherization and energy efficiency. Those are programs similar to the last stimulus bill that are coming down through the state energy offices of our country. So they're weatherization, low income assistance, let's see, energy efficiency block grants to communities and the like. There's a whole focus on grid investment, and I'll let folks like Lee Mazaki and others from Pike speak to what that means in terms of what's going to be happening around the country, not just here in North Carolina. And then there's a small segment on existing hydro and nuclear, basically efforts to keep the zero carbon generation resources we already have operating. You know, we've got a good start. Let's hang on to that. But the last area is the research and development, and that's where, as I say, that's where the puck is going, and we'll talk about that if I could have the next slide. As was mentioned earlier, the large majority of this is going to carbon capture, and in North Carolina, we don't have the geology to really be a big player there. But the other, and there's some demonstrations that will be across the country, but the two areas where I think North Carolina is very well poised and see a fair bit of action is in the area of hydrogen and advanced nuclear. We have, particularly in the Charlotte area, one of the largest nuclear clusters in the country, with a lot of companies that are doing a lot of very interesting things there. And if any of you are in the investment community, you know there's a lot of investment going on in small modular reactors, announcements coming out daily. We actually have a project going, one of those research projects where we track all that around the globe. And it literally is every week there's a new announcement. The same is true for hydrogen. technology. And this is where we really are focusing, because I think there's a huge opportunity for North Carolina here. $8 billion. The plan, as we understand it, is to invest in some hydrogen hubs, somewhere between 4 and 8. So we're looking at grants that will probably be in the order of $1 to $2 billion. And so we've been at E4 have been really focusing and trying to pull together information on that industry, as well as many of the players. If I have the next slide, this is a work in progress. I don't have the final results, but part of the inventory that we have done to identify the companies that are involved in the hydrogen economy in the Carolinas. You can see there are quite a few here. This is work typical of what we do here at E4 Carolinas. If I could have the next slide. The finished result has more results like this, where we actually can quantify it. This happens to be the lithium-ion battery one, a project that we completed last year. And obviously what we do is we share this with the economic development folks and policymakers to say, we do have an energy industry here in these particular sectors. We have advantages and opportunities, but we've identified the number of companies, the volume of work that they're doing, and the color coding is basically what portion of the supply chain they're in. It's a lot about supply chain analysis and what's happening. But back on hydrogen, we convened, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago now, a call in the Southeast region, not just the Carolinas, to talk about and pull together a group to prepare for that solicitation from DOE on hydrogen. We had over 250 people join that call. They ended up putting together 5 different task forces, and they've been meeting weekly since that time to prepare for that. The notion being, let's make sure one of those hubs is here in North Carolina. Let's make sure that our hydrogen industry really has the opportunity to grow. If I could have the next slide. I do want to spend a little bit of time on a bill that has not passed, and go ahead and click it. I think we all can understand. Go ahead, next slide. That this bill is really dead. However, there are elements of it that may be very relevant and we may see, and I'll defer to folks who are closer to DC in terms of what the actual prospects are. Some that are very interesting is some of the things that are going around tax credits. So I think I have the next slide. And there's a whole bunch of, what I'm hearing is that it may well be some appetite for passing legislation that would extend and expand many of the tax credits. I won't go into this in detail. I'm not a CPA, so I couldn't share all the details, but 2 things that are important. The 2 biggest, or 2 of the biggest elements, are the production tax credit, the PTC, and the investment tax credit, the ITC. 2 tax credits that are used by the wind and solar industry extensively. If we go to the next slide. What's really interesting in this bill is that while in the past, in current way these tax credits are used, you have to have the tax liability to receive the credit. One of the features of this bill is that it would be a direct payment for making those investments and producing those assets on the ground. That obviously would change the way that those 2 industries really go about putting their project financing together, and I think would really end up accelerating it. So North Carolina, which at one point was number 2 in the nation in solar, we're actually number 4 now. Florida and Texas passed this last year. We'll continue, I think, to see investment of those sorts. This probably will accelerate that for the companies that are in those renewables arenas. And with that, I will finish. And I guess, George, it's back to you, or
Well, thank you to each of you, Christopher, Mark, and John, for your insights and that valuable information. I look forward to diving deeper into each of these topics that you all have talked about already during our question and answer period. First, we're going to have a short networking break. We hope you utilize this time for networking with your fellow attendees, the sponsors, and exhibitors, as well as for refreshments. We'll resume at 10:45, so please be back in your seats a few minutes prior to that. All right, well, as we get into our closing session here with our panel discussion, our Q&A, we'd like to encourage all of you to be engaged in our discussion. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. If you're here in person, if you're watching on our live stream, you can put a question into the chat box. And we will take turns getting to each of your questions as time allows. So I think we'll start with Christopher. I'd like to start maybe on a more macro level of energy policy that you kind of touched on in your opening remarks. We've heard the speakers today talk a lot about the vital role that federal, state, and local public policy plays in shaping and driving energy industry innovation, particularly when it comes to carbon reduction. However, we often see a sort of a thumb on the scale when it comes to specific energy mixes that can be prescribed in public policy. What do you believe is the right approach in public policy to help us reach towards meaningful carbon reduction goals, but while also maintaining affordability and reliability?
I love that question. I wish members of Congress would ask it to themselves more often. I think first and foremost, you have to look at what the net goal is. And we were just having this conversation 30 seconds ago. Market analysts have difficulties picking winners and losers when it comes to investments. Politicians have a historically horrible track record at picking winners and losers. So I would say if the goal is decarbonization, then the incentives should be focused on decarbonization and carbon intensity and not the particular technology that gets you there. To wit, when they were debating Build Back Better, it hadn't gotten to the Senate yet. And we all know that Joe Manchin basically said it's dead. But the Senate was poised to include a technology neutral tax credit that would replace the existing technology by technology tax credit. So instead of, you have an investment tax credit for solar and a production tax credit for wind and several other technologies, it's all based on how effective they are across a bunch of different metrics at reducing emissions. But I would say even before you get there, if you front load the incentives, then you are encouraging and almost forcing industry to invest in existing technologies, which sometimes is smart. Sometimes it's not smart because it may carve out or prevent the next technology, which may even be even better, from breaking through. If all the capital has already gone into existing technologies, then you're stuck there. And we see this with Europe, where they have feed-in tariffs, where you just have to meet a minimum requirement, and then you get the incentive. That takes away any incentive from going above and beyond and innovating to the next level. So at the end of the day, it's all about tech neutral, but also looking future. How do you preserve market space for the next technology that may win the day?
Thank you for that. Mark, I'd like to talk a little bit about this carbon reduction from utilities perspective. So, Duke is tackling the issue of carbon reduction head on. Just last week, the company announced additional ambitious emissions reduction goals that kind of reinforced the utility as a leader in this area. Doing this all while adhering to North Carolina's reliability and affordability standards. So maybe you could tell us more about how kind of the rubber of public policy meets the road of delivering electricity. How does the federal infrastructure bill and the state policies you talked about in 951 assist Duke in achieving these goals within that incredibly complicated regulatory trifecta of lowering carbon, keeping energy affordable, and strengthening reliability?
That's a big question. A lot of words there. It's funny, you talked about people getting it wrong, right? Did anybody watch the Super Bowl? You saw the commercial, "Don't be like Larry." Did you ever see that commercial? If you didn't see it, you have to watch it, right? You got to go watch, you just go to YouTube and Super Bowl commercial, "Don't be like Larry." It's classic because there is a real risk in picking the wrong horse, right? And so I think sticking with principles makes a tremendous amount of sense. Knowing what the goalpost is obviously matters tremendously. Prior to Energy Solutions Act for North Carolina, we at Duke had our own carbon aspirations. If you go back to the fall of 2019, I believe, may have been the fall of 2020. It was the fall of 2018. We as a company had been thinking about renewed carbon reduction goals for some time. Something that we believed in. Our customers sometimes tend to get a little bit nervous, particularly our big customers, because affordability matters, competitive edges matter. For many of our large customers, the price of electricity is what makes them able to be competitive versus other places. So all those things matter, but we really do believe in our responsibilities to reduce our carbon footprint. And so in 2018, we announced new goals, at least 50% reduction from our operations by 2030 and net zero by 2050. When we say at least 50%, that's an enterprise-wide goal, right? So that was an acknowledgement that we operate in other regulated jurisdictions, not just North Carolina, South Carolina, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Florida, Tennessee. And each of those jurisdictions are different. The policy appetite in each of those jurisdictions is different. And so we adopted an enterprise-wide strategy or goal, at least 50%. But we knew that in North Carolina, we were likely going to do better than that. And indeed, we probably needed to do better than that to help the enterprise at large, because in North Carolina, we're about 50% of our revenue, or the Carolinas, about 50% of our generation mix. And so in order to reach an enterprise-wide goal, the Carolinas have to do a lot of heavy lifting. Thankfully, we have House Bill 951. It puts a stake in the ground that we can really use as sort of the metric against which we measure our progress. The great thing about the Jobs Act and the infrastructure work coming out of DC is the acknowledgement that you've got to have new technologies, right? There's no question that in order to achieve 2050, we're going to have to rely on technologies that don't exist today. But to get to our 2030 goal, I mean, at a big utility like us, of course, we have to plan for the future, but we've also got to execute every single day. And they've said that the grid is the most complex machine ever built. When you think about the transition, we like to use that word, building a plane while flying it. I like to think of it a little bit differently. You're actually converting the plane from powered by jet fuel to one powered by a battery while it's in the air full of passengers. And you're trying to do it so you can safely land the plane and do it in an affordable way. That's really kind of the proposition. We've got a grid that's spectacularly complex. Our customers rely on it. And so the Jobs Act provides us opportunities to deploy technologies to modernize that grid, make it more resilient, enable the technologies of the future, enable the rapid transition in our transit system. So it's all about, from my perspective, grid and grid and grid in the near term to sort of help us get to that 2030 objective that was memorialized in the Act. And then really start looking at those advanced technologies and interconnecting advanced technologies to further decarbonize the system. I mean, we all know that the tail of the carbon is going to be the hardest to remove, right? And we're going to have to rely on things that, as Christopher said, don't exist today. So we're excited about the Act. We're excited about all the prospects that it offers, but really our focus has to be on executing every day for our customers in a way that maintains affordability and competitiveness for chamber members. And it does so in a way that that ensures that when you go to flip the light switch, it works always, and you don't have to think twice about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. John, we've talked a lot about how these federal and state policies are driving us towards carbon reduction and kind of the efforts to kind of fit those into practice. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about the economic development side of these federal and state policies. So when we think about energy states or states that are associated with energy jobs, I think we automatically think of fossil fuel states like Texas or North Dakota, West Virginia. But as we've talked about today, there are literally hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy investments that are looking for a place to land. Now, North Carolina has received an influx of energy investments in recent years. But John, if you could tell us more about, where is this investment going, and how do we put North Carolina's name on the map as an energy jobs state? And if you were thinking about like narrowing this question, if it was your job to advise the Department of Commerce, what would you tell them?
Oh boy, advise the Department of Commerce. Okay. Well, I guess first of all obviously we want to maintain a diversity of what we're doing. As it's been pointed out, none of us knows what, the answers for the future are going to be. But I can be fairly confident there are going to be multiple answers. And so we, at this point, shouldn't be narrowing down too closely and saying, well, it should only be renewables or it could only be nuclear in terms of energy supply, but to continue to keep all of those options open. Excuse me. And to that end, I think there's some things that North Carolina has to its benefit. One is, as I mentioned when I was speaking, in the Charlotte area, we have a pretty good concentration of companies in the nuclear industry. That is a zero carbon source of energy. And so I think it's worthy of, let's figure out where that can go and what we can do with it. It's still early in the technology. Some here are probably closer to it than I, but we're still many years away from seeing something in commercial use, or we may see demonstrations. But also we have, North Carolina has one of the best wind resources in offshore. And there's a huge economic opportunity there. When the wind industry, offshore wind industry develops in this country, you'll see those states on the eastern seaboard that have manufacturing capability serving that industry. Because once you build the towers themselves, the blades, whatever, you can't transport them overland. These things are too big and massive. They have to go by water. And as long as you have a port, you can do that. And so what does North Carolina have? We've got Nucor steel that can make towers. We've got ports on our coast. There's no reason that North Carolina can't be a huge player in the offshore wind industry. That too is some years out, but I think you need to start laying the foundation for that. Another arena, I mentioned it, North Carolina was at one point #2 in the nation in solar that was deployed. And we continue to build more. The utility builds more, they're independent power producers, they're building more. And that's a huge untold economic development story, particularly for those people who are concerned about economic development in our tier 1 and tier 2 counties, the rural, lower wealth counties of our state. The solar industry over the past 10 years or so has invested more than $9 billion in solar infrastructure, primarily again in those rural states. That doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but believe me, the landowners who are leasing their land to the solar developers, the solar operators, the local jurisdictions who are seeing their tax base go up dramatically, it's a big deal to them. And so, there again, I know, Department of Commerce is very concerned, the legislature is very concerned about economic development in our lower wealth counties. And it's some of these technologies benefit those communities very, very well. At the same time, we have to be aware of the fact that we're shuttering, or Duke is shuttering a lot of plants, coal plants primarily, that have been jobs in some of those same communities. And so some advice in terms of providing for workforce development, training, and the like, so that those workers who have been working in traditional fossil fueled plants have a continued future in the energy industry, but maybe just with a different technology.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I think you've hit on an important topic when we're thinking from a statewide perspective, that there's a lot of interest in making sure that the economic development is reaching all parts of the state. Often we see economic development kind of favoring the urban areas in the state, leaving rural regions with sometimes diminishing opportunities. You mentioned briefly there about coal plant closures. And so maybe I want to give Mark a chance to give a little perspective from Duke. We know that over the next few years, Duke is planning to close its coal plants, mainly in rural areas, which would mean the loss of coal-specific jobs. So kind of following on John's thoughts there, Mark, how should we address that kind of economic and jobs issue in rural areas?
So it's a good question. I talked a little bit about clean smokestacks in the opening, and really when you think about the coal fleet in North Carolina, it's been under a transition since about 2011, 2010. Back in those days, we had 14 or 15 coal-fired power stations in North Carolina. I believe we're down to 5. Some of those don't operate a tremendous amount. One of the things that we did, interestingly, so when I first came to work at Duke, I was an electrostatic precipitator engineer at coal units. And full disclosure, I didn't know how to spell precipitator when I started in that role. But I learned a tremendous amount, and I spent a lot of time at coal plants, and just incredibly intelligent folks that can fix and build anything. And that is a skill set that is not that common, right? And so one of the things that we did when we were retiring coal units was create traveling maintenance crews for other stuff. And that was kind of a cool example where you take people that have tremendous institutional talent, tremendous ability, and you repurpose them and give them an opportunity to continue to do meaningful stuff. And so those traveling maintenance crews travel around the state working on different facilities. I could see doing some of that, but the thing about coal stations, and show of hands, how many people have been to a coal-fired power plant? So a pretty healthy percentage. You'll know that they're big. You'll know that they're typically rural. You'll know that there's a lot of transmission infrastructure, and you'll know that there's access usually to lots of water. So all of those things are kind of the recipe for a new facility, right? But you've already got the infrastructure in place. So when you think about new generation, some of it may be natural gas, some of it may be big batteries. I mean, who knows? There's all sorts of opportunities that are out there. Those sites are assets. They're assets in the communities from an economic perspective, but they're also an asset from an infrastructure perspective, because there is stuff there that you need to make the business of energy happen. And so it stands to reason that when you're looking at opportunities out there to build generation, why not look at repurposing sites that you already have? So I think that's something we'll probably do. We'll probably spend some time thinking about repurposing maintenance crews like we did when we retired some of the earlier units. But to your point, I think folks probably saw the announcement that we made last week. We're going to be out of coal as a company by 2035, enterprise-wide. Now, that's a big deal sort of outside of North Carolina. We're sort of already on that trajectory here. And in 2030, I believe the other metric was only about 5% of the energy that we deliver to customers will be derived from the combustion of coal. So that means that the vast majority of time we're going to be utilizing other assets. And we were already on that path in North Carolina. So the announcement doesn't really affect the work we're doing from a transition perspective, but it absolutely underscores the importance of transitioning those communities in a way that minimizes the impact of job loss, of shuttering facilities that have been there, in some cases for 50, 60, 70 years. So that's top of mind for us. I think there's going to be opportunity to repurpose some of those sites. There's going to be opportunity to figure out ways to retrain staff, and we'll be focused on that as we're going through this transition.
Well, thank you for that. I know that's great insight, and on a topic that's top of mind for a lot of folks across the state. Christopher, I guess if I've given the other panelists maybe a little pointed question, we talked about rural economic development, coal plant closures, so it's only fair to maybe put you on the defensive a little bit too. You touched upon in your opening remarks how important carbon-free nuclear power, along with strategic natural gas, how they play a critical role in forming the backbone of a clean energy economy. Now, this notion may still be a little controversial to some folks. So give you a chance maybe to talk a little bit more about that. What will the role of emerging technologies like advanced nuclear, or even preserving our existing nuclear, what role will those types of that type of infrastructure play in the future cleaning energy economy?
Not on the defensive at all. I guess there's 2 points here. One, and I won't make this about any particular company, especially since I'm sitting next to somebody from a particular company, but all of my members have made aspirational commitments. Many of them are net zero. Oil and gas, utilities, manufacturing, none of them can tell you how they're going to get there. And that's fine. They need to drive towards that. But there needs to be those technologies, there needs to be that pathway. In the meantime, we still need reliability more than anything else, because even if the federal government came in and overlaid a regulation that would require essentially shutting down generation, they can't do that. They owe the state reliability. And so they would pay the fine and keep the lights on. So we need to keep pace with innovation. Right now, that is, as you pointed out, it's absolutely natural gas and nuclear, taking them separately. Natural gas is the backbone of a clean energy economy. We've led the world, #1 in the world in reducing CO2 emissions since 2005, exclusively because of the largesse of natural gas we have that our friends in the oil and gas basins have delivered us. First, it was enabling fuel switching from coal to gas. We've shut down more than half. At this point, it's about 60% of our coal-fired generation in this country since 2010. A lot of that was regulatory. The vast majority of it was market-based. We had a lot of gas, it was cheap, we were able to switch. In the last 5 to 10 years, gas has been the backbone of enabling renewable deployment. Like I said before, renewables are intermittent. Without gas, they do not exist, period. You can't have an intermittent power source unless you have a standby source that can immediately ramp up when the sun goes away or the wind goes away. So gas has been there. Now, is gas as we see it today part of a net zero end line? Probably not as we see it, but that's why other technologies like CCUS are so important. And I will take issue with what both of you said about CCUS. Yeah, I get it. Geology matters, but that's why we have pipelines. If you're going to decarbonize your industrial sector, you have to be able to capture that carbon, and it has to go somewhere. I get it. Places like Texas and New Mexico and Louisiana are much better suited for sequestering, but don't forget you have a coastline too, and that's an emerging sector. Sequestering in the Outer Continental Shelf. And then going back to nuclear, you all are blessed with a market structure that preserves what the PU, the smart way forward. A lot of other places in the country, it's just survival of the fittest based on the markets. And we've closed 12 full-scale light water nuclear power plants in the last 10 years. I mean, that is the most asinine climate step backwards you could ever possibly hope for. They are irreplaceable. Until we have a baseload source other than nuclear, they're literally irreplaceable. You cannot replace a light water reactor with wind or solar because of the intermittency. Now, maybe that changes tomorrow. Maybe there's a breakthrough in storage that enables renewables to replace baseload sources. But until then, you can't do that. And in the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, there is $6 billion in some form of credit. DOE is right now, just went out last week with a request for information, how they should divvy this up in order to help keep those alive. We've gotten to the point now where even the biggest climate hawks in Congress, progressive liberals have said, look, climate change is an existential threat. So we have to relook at everything. There's no such thing as a bad solution. If you would have told me that the Democratic candidate for president was going to run on a platform that included support of nuclear and carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, I would have told you you're nuts. But Joe Biden did that. And so far, he's kept his word. DOE is very focused on preserving existing nuclear as well as developing tomorrow's nuclear and developing CCUS. I mean, it gives me a lot of hope that you had a bipartisan bill like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and you see more and more traditional liberals coming around to saying, look, nuclear has a place. At a minimum, we can all agree that we need to preserve the existing fleet because that is 8 steps backwards if every time we close one. So we're moving in the right direction from bipartisanship, but right now, nuclear and gas, it's what keeps the lights on.
Thank you, and appreciate that, and your ability to kind of drive home the point of the importance of base load power there. Mark, we've been talking about the role of nuclear and gas. So I'd like to circle back with you on renewables and the role that they're going to play in North Carolina's grid moving forward. With specific inclusion of renewable energy solutions in the recently passed state law 951, how does one reconcile investing in and deploying renewable energy sources that in the short term at least, are more expensive or maybe priced at a premium with the mandate from the Utilities Commission that traditionally, requires a least cost option. Are these goals in conflict? And if so, how do we reconcile that?
So it's a great question. I don't think that the goals are in conflict. I don't think it's one or the other. I think when you look at the legislation, it makes it clear that we are to achieve a 70% reduction by 2030, but we are to do so using a least cost pathway. And those things aren't mutually exclusive. It's not like you're thinking about one in a vacuum or the other in a vacuum. You got to do both. And so renewables are clearly going to play a role. Transitioning away from coal is clearly going to play a role. Subsequent license renewal on nuclear is clearly going to play a role. We heard about the role of nuclear. I think folks maybe don't know that, you're sitting, I don't know, how far are we away from Harris? Like 12 miles? I don't know, 12 miles away from a nuclear power station. In the Carolinas, we operate 10,000 megawatts of nuclear. You can't replace that very easily because it's always on. Our industry takes capacity factor really seriously, and our nuclear fleet enjoyed a 95% capacity factor last year. 95% of the time it's on, and generally the only time it's not on is when you're refueling, which happens every 2 years or so. So huge role to play on the nuclear side. Renewables are clearly going to play a role, but we've got to figure out a way to interconnect renewables in an aggressive fashion, but also in a way that doesn't create bottlenecks on our grid, which sort of reinforces the need for grid investment. And we've got to do it in a way that sort of conforms to that least cost planning principle. We've got to remember that cost matters, affordability for customers matters, particularly for large customers, but really for everybody. And we can't ever afford any sort of reliability hiccups. So as we look for opportunities to deploy additional renewables and accelerate those deployments, we're also going to be looking for opportunities to deploy storage that will work in consort with those renewables to provide the reliability that customers expect. But the cost and the decarbonization, it's not an either or, right? I mean, the law makes it clear that we've got to do both. And so in doing both, we're going to be using technologies that don't emit carbon, but we're going to be proceeding in a way that's thoughtful in partnership with our communities so that they enjoy the reliability that they've come to expect. And we do all of it in a way that maintains North Carolina's competitiveness in the country. I mean, I'd say history is a great indication of our ability to do this. When you look at North Carolina, I mean, North Carolina interconnected a lot of renewables in a relatively short period of time. And, we were number 2 for a long time, and we're still a leader in the country. And we were able to do all of that while maintaining the reliability that everybody expects. And our electricity rates continue to be below the national average. So we've demonstrated an ability to do this, and we're going to continue to demonstrate that ability, keeping reliability and affordability sort of top of mind.
Thank you, John.
If I may, there's one area we haven't addressed, and we actually heard about it this morning in our keynote, dealing with this issue of how we manage the grid, and that is distributed energy management. Smart breakers are going to, that's the sort of innovation that's going to allow that match between, we remember this morning, between the generation and the consumption part of it. We've been talking on the generation side, and what do you do on the generation side? I think there's going to be equal innovation, change that's going to come, that's going to happen on the consumption side as well. And we heard a great example of that this morning.
Well, and I just want to make one comment about that. Thank you for the reminder. We haven't talked about the sort of generation transition, but when we're thinking about carbon planning, we're thinking about starting with the customer and working our way backwards. So, the easiest carbon to remove from your system is the carbon you don't emit, right? And so to the extent that we can work with customers to identify opportunities to reduce load, reduce peaks, that makes the lift that we have that much simpler. So we haven't talked a lot about it, but that's something that we're really, really focused on at the company when we're thinking about carbon planning. Let's start at the customer and work our way backwards.
I have one thing. Going into the T&D space, I didn't get a chance to get into it in the beginning, but pretty profound changes in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act as it relates to transmission. Not only did it give FERC new authority, which some state regulators may not like, to essentially force the issue. I mean, here's the deal. If we're going to have offshore wind in the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast, if we're going to continue to see the massive build out of renewables, we have to be able to site interstate transmission lines. And right now that's almost impossible. The largest wind farm in the world proposed in Oklahoma got shut down because a neighboring state, who shall remain nameless, would not allow that line to go through to another state. So we missed out on the largest wind farm in the world. So this new authority at FERC will help, hopefully, I'm sure it'll get legally challenged, but it will help site those transmission lines, the thousands, if not tens of thousands of miles we'll need. In addition to that, DOE now has money to help those states that are, we'll call them transmit by states, where it's just going through and they're like, we don't want to have anything to do with this. We certainly don't want to have to pay for it because we're not getting any benefit. So there's money there to help them appreciate that this could be beneficial to one of their neighbors, even if it's not to them. But building transmission is going to be key, especially as we see more and more new generation platforms, facilities, and new load pockets as the economy shifts. I mean, y'all are blessed. I'm from California. Everyone's leaving California and going to Texas and North Carolina. Well, that means new load growth. Great. Maybe EVs become a huge thing, new load growth. Well, we need new transmission and distribution in order to handle that. And being able to site those things has been increasingly impossible. So I'm also a little bit hopeful that these changes will bring us to the next level.
Thanks for your insight on those. I think this is a great conversation talking about the, what this transition looks like and the type of innovation and change that we need. So, I'd like to continue on that vein for a little bit. Also going back to something that Ryan mentioned in his keynote, that we talk about the energy transition. And we use that a lot when we're talking with our clients, our customers, and things like that. But sometimes I wonder if we kind of really understand what that means. What is it? What would that transition entail? Not just the way that utilities generate electricity, but it's really will affect how we use it, the technology we use, how we interact with technology, our daily routines, our jobs. And so it's kind of a big word that I think sometimes gets simplified because we use it so much. So maybe go to John with this, considering the full scope of what it means to make a clean energy transition, how is North Carolina and maybe our region in general poised to take advantage of this?
Well, I hope in my comments, I also made this clear. I think we're very well poised because of the breadth of technologies that we have and the diversity of generation sources that we currently have and can continue to build. I'm aware of other parts of the country where they are much more wedded to a particular, energy source. Some parts of the sort of upper West where it's predominated by coal and 80% or so, they're going to have a tough time with that. In other parts of the country where oil and gas is like the predominant source and they don't have that diversity, they're going to have a harder time making that transition. So I think we're very well positioned in that regard. And as was presented earlier, North Carolina in particular has had a long history of being very forward thinking, going back to smokestacks and everything else, the clean smokestacks and everything else. We've been fortunate to have elected leadership who have been proactive and forward thinking, say, let's position the state, let's make those investments, let's put in place the policies that enable that diversity of supply. And I see that continuing with what's happening in the current legislature and the current administration.
Right, thank you for that. And I think when we're talking about change, you can't talk about change without talking about risk. And Christopher, maybe point this towards you. The Global Energy Institute produces an energy security risk index each year. And notably in 2019, that was the lowest risk score to date. 2019 was also the year that the U.S. became a net exporter of oil and gas, a development that a lot of people had predicted would bring further instability to energy security. Can you talk to us about how the infrastructure bill will play a role in our energy security, both in the short term and maybe into the long term too?
Yeah, thanks. Energy security is kind of a nebulous topic, which is why about 10 years ago, we sat down with a bunch of other energy institutes at universities to try and find a way to quantify it. I mean, how do we make this an actual term? Most people think it just relates to how much oil you import or export, but there's so many other aspects to it. How many engineers are you producing? How many miles of transmission line do you have per capita? How many miles of pipeline do you have per capita? And I'll use that as a segue. Again, hypothetically, if a utility were looking to transition away from coal, well, it needs that next monkey bar. You can't let go of the rung you're on until you have the next one. Right now, and for the foreseeable future, that's gas. What does that mean? It means we need more gas infrastructure. But we've seen gas infrastructure, especially in this region, interdicted and prevented from being built. That slows down that transition. And we're going to need that pipeline infrastructure, not just for natural gas right now and tomorrow, but also for hydrogen and also to move carbon around. But going back to the energy security angle, it's critical to keep an eye on where we're going, but making sure that we know what we need in the meantime. I mean, reliability and affordability are not optional, period. I mean, it's the law when it comes to reliability. And when it comes to affordability, I mean, every public utility commission and elected politician is going to focus on that to make sure that rates are stable and the lights stay on. But let's take one little step back. Let's not forget that when it comes to energy transition, we're not just talking about the utility sector. I mean, that's one sector. Obviously, it's one of the leading emitters, but it's also led the entire economy as far as reductions and is poised to lead even further over the next 10 years. But we still have to work on transportation. Yeah, EVs have a great promise, but are people going to buy them? I mean, certainly all the OEMs have made major multi-billion-dollar commitments to build EVs, but is there demand there yet? And even if there is, do we have the supply chain of the critical elements we need? Industrial. I mean, we almost never talk about industrial things like steel and cement and petrochemical. Those are all things that our economy is built upon, literally, and will continue to be. But we don't have many options there. Those hard to decarbonize industries are a huge long pole in the tent. And then finally, agriculture. I mean, agriculture is kind of a third rail when it comes to regulation and politics, but it's one of the leading emitters. How do we address that? I think all four of them we've seen, starting with the utility sector and going to those hard to decarbonize sectors, it's about innovation. It's the only way to get there. You can't regulate innovation. You have to find ways to encourage it and incentivize it and then deploy it as quickly as possible. And I think that's where we're going, and we'll keep our energy security strong. And in the meantime, we can fall back on the fact that we're the largest producing gas producer in the world, largest producing oil producer in the world. And those are still the lifeblood of our economies. They may not be 10 years from now, they may not be 20 years from now, but right now they are. We have something that our economic competitors around the world don't have. And we see how they're reeling right now, whether it's in Europe or Asia, because of short supplies. I mean, we're in great shape compared to the rest of the world right now because we've been able to bring those online in the most environmentally sensitive way possible.
Thank you for that. We have a few minutes left here, and I want to save time right at the end to kind of ask an open-ended question in case there's something else that we haven't covered yet, but would like to take a moment for questions from the audience. So if anybody does have a question, raise your hand. We can get a microphone to you.
Thank you for your insights, insightful Q&A. Wayne Bowles, Milligan Bridge, Government and Public Affairs. One thing that's not been discussed as part of the equation of North Carolina's energy security is the tremendous natural gas assets that we have off our coast. And back in the 80s, Chevron and Mobil were interested in drilling what is called the Manio Exploration Unit. And so the preponderance of science, the last time I checked, it may be an old report, is that we have an abundance of natural gas. Why not tap that natural gas, pipe it into the state, and reap the economic benefits of that? And I'll address that, please. Thank you.
I'll take it at the federal side. Good to see you again, Wayne. There's just not appetite for it, period. I mean, 10 years ago was a lot different. We had very significant support in the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. I'm not sure what's happened down here because I'm not down here, but things shifted significantly. So there's, at the federal level, there's not appetite for it. President Trump withdrew a significant portion of the OCS for development, meaning that it can't get developed unless a subsequent president puts it back on the table. So the good news is that you're a couple hundred miles away from the second largest natural gas field in the world, in Marcellus Shale. And it's, for all intents and purposes, an unlimited supply. It's just getting it here. And that same would be true if it was being produced offshore. Producing that infrastructure or being able to build that infrastructure is so important. And the people who, we'll just call them activists, who don't want to see progress, they know that's an Achilles heel. If we can stop the infrastructure, we can stop that transition. And right now, that's the problem. How do you get gas from West Virginia and Pennsylvania down here so that we can continue, you can continue to move that near-term carbon reduction goals with the existing technology that we have? And right now, it's increasingly difficult to build those pipelines.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, Mike Mazzola, EPIC, UNC Charlotte. Great. I love that word, Trevor, interdicted. That's definitely what happened with the ACC. And but it does highlight, one of the most single important challenges, threats to an orderly energy transformation. But let's talk about offshore wind, because it lines up different interveners in either opposing or supporting it. The Governor Cooper just announced the Towers Commission, and it's being represented as not a big energy opportunity, but a big business opportunity. And so we're North Carolina business community here. Are we interested in the billions of dollars and thousands or tens of thousands of jobs that the governor says is available if we embrace the offshore wind industry?
Well, you're speaking to something that I've long wondered why we haven't been more active in that. I was good 10 years or so ago. I had the opportunity to travel to Germany on an energy study trip, and visited northern Germany on the north coast there. Visited a small town called Rostock that has a thriving economy, a former East German town, but they basically produce much of the equipment, the blades and the towers for offshore wind. And when we went and talked to them, they export those to Turkey. So they build them in northern Germany, put them on a barge, and ship them all around. To my point, I hope I made earlier, is we have a huge economic opportunity here. The other part is that North Carolina has a historically strong manufacturing base. And so all of the equipment that needs to be put in, including, I would add, I think, well, one in North Carolina, one in South Carolina, companies that make the marine cable for, basically electrically connecting these wind turbines exist here in the States. So there's a huge economic opportunity. I mean, I think there's a reason the governor has made that move. And those of you who don't know, that he also named a new deputy assistant secretary for clean energy transition to the Department of Commerce to specifically focus on that, a woman by the name of Jennifer Munt, who knows her energy very, very well. So yes, I think there's a huge economic opportunity for North Carolina, not just in terms of producing energy off our coast, supplying the offshore wind up and down the entire eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico.
If I could really quickly, it's not too late. The first commercial offshore wind farm is under construction right now. I mean, most people think we already have them. There's a few turbines out there as sort of tests, but we haven't built one yet. And that's been largely because of NIMBY and permitting. But to John's point, there's going to be a need for an industrial base somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. The one in the Northeast is already under construction. And if you look at the massive amount of economic development that goes into the Gulf Coast to support offshore oil and gas production, it's going to be mirrored the same way. The question is it going to be in Norfolk, or is it going to be in North Carolina, or is it going to be in South Carolina? And so I give North Carolina credit for being on being in the lead, or at least pushing to be there, because there's going to be concentration, and it's probably only going to be in one place. So it's the first one to the finish line.
And I would add, unfortunately, Virginia has gotten a bit of a jump on us in the Norfolk area. The very first vessel to build and maintain offshore wind turbines that's licensed to operate in U.S. coastal waters, there's a thing called the Jones Act, which says if you're going to operate within coastal waters, you have to it has to be done on a vessel that was built in the U.S. and operated by U.S. seamen. That first vessel is going to be berthed at Norfolk, and it will be servicing that construction up in New England.
456 feet long, as I understand.
Oh, is that okay?
It's a very large ship.
So yeah, yes, we do have the resources, we do have the coast, we do have the ports, and we need to do some recruiting of that supply chain to support that industry.
I appreciate the time for all of you that you've taken to give us your insights, maybe on 30 seconds, if you have any closing remarks or thoughts that we didn't hit on. Great. Well, we appreciate it. Appreciate your time and your expertise in sharing that with us. And we can give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. We'll give it to George.
So it's fantastic discussion today. Trevor, thanks for managing that panel. Thank you, panelists. Thank you for all the presenters today. I have thoroughly enjoyed being here in person. Got to see a bunch of old friends, make some new friends. So I hope that this is the beginning of a lot of face-to-face meetings for us all. On behalf of the North Carolina Chamber, I want to extend our deepest gratitude to the sponsors, the speakers, and everyone in the audience for taking time and an active role in today's discussion and summit. Not just today, though, throughout the year, as we continue to work together, as we've heard all the opportunities to work together and collaborate, we need to do so to secure a modern, affordable, and sustainable energy future for our state. So as you travel home, please be safe. Be on the lookout for your inbox for a recording and an email with a recording in the next couple of days. Thank you for your attendance and look forward to seeing you soon.